They called it liquid sunshine, a miracle elixir for your health, but they lied. In today's Curious and Clean, we're going to talk about the Radium Girls. Hello, my name is Kate, and welcome back to another episode of Curious and Clean, our cleaning and learning series here on It Came From a Vlog. This series was born of my love for cleaning videos and interesting stories. So here on Curious and Clean, we're going to be cleaning, but we're also going to be learning something new together. For this episode, we're going to be tackling my very dirty and disorganized fridge. And today's story is a very intriguing and eye-opening one. But a little bit of a disclaimer, there is some graphic content, there's no violence, but there is a little bit of blood, and there are definitely some painful conditions described. That aside, I'm ready if you're ready. So let's get curious and clean. On the 21st of December, 1898, Marie Curie and her husband Pierre discovered radium. Named for the Latin word radius or ray, it was named to recognize radium's power for emitting energy in the form of rays. It was quickly put to use as a cancer treatment. Today, we know that radium is a highly radioactive element and can be extremely dangerous. However, it was once used in many everyday products, from toothpaste to watches. It was even thought to have curative properties. Taken almost the same way that we take vitamins today, it was a popular health tonic, and people were fascinated and intrigued by its power. This advertisement states that for good health, you should get plenty of sleep, exercise, and enjoy wholesome fun. And don't forget to drink plenty of fresh, invigorating, natural radioactive water from the Radium Spa. Radium water, like the one advertised in that ad, was simply distilled water with tiny amounts of the substance inside of it. It promised to tackle various ailments from arthritis to general malaise. After all, people knew that radium released energy, and all energy was good energy, right? Put a healthy glow in your cheeks, or use radium boot polish on your shoes. Radium was totally in vogue, but the number one use was for wristwatches. Radium's glow-in-the-dark properties were perfect for watch faces, allowing customers to see the time even in the dark. These wristwatches were an irresistible novelty. Their luminous paint didn't require any sunshine. It was just pure magic. One of the very first factories to produce these luminous watches opened in New Jersey in 1916. Throughout the years, thousands of women would be employed in many similar factories throughout the United States. About 70 women worked at this factory, doing the delicate and tedious task of painting the tiny watch dials with the radium paint. To keep their brushes pointed and their work accurate, they were instructed to use their lips to point their brushes. The point was better for rendering the fine details of the small watch faces, and the paint they used was radium paint. Radioactive, dangerous, deadly, and with every brushstroke and every painted watch face, they were ingesting more and more of it. These women became known as the Radium Girls. When radium is ingested, it is particularly dangerous. Case in point, Mr. Eben Byers, an American socialite and athlete who was notorious for drinking a bottle of radium water every day for years before dying of it. The headline of the Wall Street Journal story on his death stated that the radium water worked fine until his jaw came off. But of course, the Radium Girls didn't know about this at that time. It was widely accepted to be good for you. How could they have known that ingesting radium could cause radiation-induced bone necrosis and bone cancer? And at the high doses that the Radium Girls were exposed to, this could happen in just a few short years. When they asked if the paint was harmful, their manager said it was safe. But of course they would. Money and business depended on it, and radium cost a lot of money. In fact, it was the most expensive substance in the world at that time, costing the equivalent of $2.2 million per gram in today's money. After being told that radium was harmless, some of these girls even used the radioactive paint on their fingernails, teeth, and face. The job did have a certain allure. When they mixed the paint, the shimmering dust filled the air, covering the woman's clothes and hair. Some even wore their best dresses to the factory, so that they would be covered in the luminescent dust and would glow in the dark when they went dancing later in the evening. These workers actually believed that they were getting healthier by working with radium. Part of the confusion with that is that radium actually gives the illusion of good health because it stimulates the red blood cells, but over time, it is poison. The women absolutely loved their job. It was, quote, an elite job for poor working girls. Not only were they able to work in a time when it was difficult to find employment as a woman, they were actually considered artists. They were encouraged to bring sisters and friends to join them in the factories, and many happily took their supervisors up on this offer. They felt like they were helping the wartime effort. After all, the young 18-year-old girl named Grace Fryer, who started working in the Orange, New Jersey plant, began just 4 days after the U.S. joined World War I. She had a soldier brother, and this was a way that she could help with the war effort by providing our brave men overseas with magical watches. The plant was owned by the U.S. Radium Corporation, the biggest name in the business. Their purification of radium to produce luminous paint was marketed under the name Undark. They were a major supplier to the military, and they provided thousands upon thousands of radioluminescent watches for our troops. And their plant in Orange, New Jersey employed as many as 300 workers, mostly young women who painted the watch faces, like young Grace Fryer, who I already introduced you to. The company hired women to perform the dangerous tasks, including handling radium, while the scientists and owners and stakeholders were familiar with the dangerous effects of radium and were able to carefully avoid any exposure for themselves. Chemists at the U.S. Radium Corporation plant used lead screens to protect themselves, as well as masks and tongs when they handled the radium. Meanwhile, the radium girls continued their work with no protection, painting watch faces, and they were paid about a penny and a half per dial, about 30 cents a watch in today's money. After a few strokes, the paintbrushes lost their point and the work became less sharp. Their supervisors instructed them in the way that I mentioned earlier: lip, dip, paint, and this helped keep their work accurate. This same approach was adopted at least 2 other factories, and the female workers at these 3 factories are the ones that are now referred to as the Radium Girls. As you can probably already imagine, it was not long before the devastating effects began. The first people to start seeing problems among the dial painters were dentists. Loose teeth, lesions, ulcers, and dental pain were the first conditions to show up. Women were experiencing their teeth falling out, anemia, necrosis of the jaw, a condition which is now known as radium jaw, as well as bone fractures and suppression of menstruation and sterility. To diagnose the women, they gave them x-rays, which likely only compounded their exposure to radiation. As the medical issues became hard to ignore, U.S. Radium and similar companies rejected the workers' claims. They even went so far as to encourage medical professionals to attribute the workers' deaths to other causes, specifically syphilis. Syphilis is a terrible and notorious sexually transmitted infection. Not only was this used to smear the women's reputations, it was also something very rarely talked about. So a diagnosis of syphilis would encourage a woman to keep it quiet out of embarrassment and shame. It was a cruel way to sweep their cover-up under the rug. In 1922, the first dial painter died. Her name was Molly Madja, and she was one of 4 sisters who worked at the plant. A year before she died, her jaw fell away from her skull. She developed anemia, and her mouth would not stop bleeding, and she was wrongly diagnosed as having syphilis. Soon after, 50 more women who had worked at the plant were sick, and a dozen had died. Crumbling teeth, collapsed spines, pregnancy complications, aching joints, extreme exhaustion, and hemorrhaging were just some of the symptoms. The radiation poisoning was ravaging their bodies, and the company still denied any wrongdoing. But they did take some action. They hired an independent company to come and investigate their declining business, not the health problems of the workers, just to investigate declining sales. It was around this time that Grace Fryer, one of the workers from the New Jersey plant, decided to sue. But it took her 2 full years to find a lawyer who was even willing to help her. Going against such a massive, powerful company was not something that most lawyers were willing to do. They considered the U.S. Radium Corporation to be a national institution and untouchable. The inventor of radium dial paint, Dr. Sabin Sochaki, died himself 2 years later, and he was the 16th known victim of radium poisoning from dial paint. Unlike the female factory workers, he died from radium in his hands, not his mouth. But the circumstances that surrounded his death ultimately helped the Radium girls in court as they fought for justice. Grace teamed up with 4 fellow workers and they filed their court case in 1927, making front-page news around the world. This case has become a cornerstone of occupational hazard law today. As much as I would love to say that the story ended there, it doesn't. In Ottawa, Illinois, a similar studio owned by the Radium Dial Company was still painting dials for clocks with radium paint. The workers there were also young women, and they were completely unaware of the trial and the proceedings in New Jersey. At this time, the Radium Dial Company had authorized physicals and tests to determine the toxicity of radium paint to the employees, but they never even gave those records to the employees or told them the results. They kept everything under wraps. Their only attempt at making things better was to stop using paintbrushes and to give the workers glass pens with a fine point. But the workers found that these pens slowed down their productivity, and hey, they were paid by the piece after all, so they continued to work with brushes, not knowing the consequences. When the news of the trials in New Jersey finally appeared in the newspapers, the women were still told that radium was safe, and the employees in New Jersey were showing signs of viral infections like syphilis, so they just continued to come to work like normal. At the highest point, the Radium Dial Company employed 1,000 young women who turned out 4,300 dials a day. By 1927, the dangers and risks associated with radium were well known. Most women were suing, and the lip-pointing technique they had used had been completely discontinued. The workers finally had access to protective gear. In 1928, the New Jersey case was settled in the women's favor. The surviving women received compensation, $10,000 each and $600 per year of their life. And finally, their death certificates would state the correct cause of death. It wasn't much consolation, though. The radium was literally boring holes through the women's bones while they were alive, a horrifying and agonizing, painful reality. Throughout history, and even now, women's pain and medical issues are not taken as seriously as men's. Women are often misdiagnosed and inadequately treated, and in the case of the Radium girls, it was no different. It took the death of a man, the inventor of the radium paint himself, for these women to see justice at all. It's a frustrating and upsetting case about our own society and the abuse of big corporations who put human life on the back burner, all in worship of the almighty dollar. Today, the U.S. Radium Corporation is notorious for its operations during this time, and their corruption became well known. It ultimately led to stronger worker protection laws, but at what cost? Although it's difficult to calculate exactly how many women suffered from the ingestion of radium, it's likely in the thousands. Some of the effects might have been experienced later in life with various forms of cancer. But once radium enters the body, there is no way to get it out. Much of our understanding of the effects of radium on the human body are thanks to these women, and their contributions to protecting workers' rights have been invaluable. But even today, over 100 years later, the Radium girls' bodies still glow in their graves, and a Geiger counter will spike. The effects of radiation poisoning live on, even after the grave. I know this story was a really sad one, but I want to thank you for joining me on today's Curious and Clean. If you're looking for more information, there are numerous articles and books, and there's even a movie that came out in 2020 called Radium Girls, and it stars Joey King. I think they did a really good job with it because you can really feel the outrage in this case. I think it's an important story that needed to be told and remembered, and on this little corner of the internet today, we are holding a space for the Radium girls. I hope that you'll join me next time here on It Came From a Vlog. Bye-bye.